All right, so today we're going to be looking at the various types of TIG options that we have here in the shop. We've got fairly simple setups with gas-cooled torches that can plug directly into the end of our harnesses, and we've got there are 3 Dynasty TIG machines. There's an older Dynasty 350, and there are 2 at this point in time Dynasty 300s here in the shop. So we're going to fire these things up, show you how to set them up, and talk about basics of TIG, getting started. All right, before we talk about how to set these machines up for TIG, we've got to know what the options are. And we're going to start with the simplest option. The simplest option here in this shop is TIG welding with a simple gas-cooled torch with a gas valve. This particular torch is a 150 amp torch, and this torch has a connector on the end that's a simple DINS connector. This plugs into the harness in the booth. This way, we're going to simply unhook the flux core wire feeder, or the wire feeder, and we're going to hook up a TIG torch. We'll make the settings on the front end of the machine. We will turn the gas valve on when we want gas, and we will either scratch start or preferably lift start. There's also an option to use a remote control to turn the torch on and off. I have a few remote options, being both wireless, wired foot pedals. I have some thumb controls, and but for the most part, when the students are first learning, we're simply going to set the amperage at what they feel is appropriate, scratch that thing, and start walking the cut. Okay, so that's option number 1. Option number 2 is basically the same thing, except we're using a 200 amp torch. Now this one has also a gas valve. I've got different front end parts on it. But this torch has a traditional connector that has the gas hose as a part of it, and this connector is a lot longer than it needs to be, if I can get it up in camera. But when we have it set up with our quick disconnect fittings, it's a relatively large end. But again, it's a single hose that goes down through the torch, okay? It's not a separate piece, and this is rated for up to 200 amps. Option number 3 is to use a liquid cooled torch. So this torch right here is a 250 amp torch. This is on the Dynasty 350, and this particular torch has a red and blue line for hot and cold water as it comes in and out of the cooler, and of course it has a separate power cable. The red line is the power cable. It's liquid cooled, and I guess there's a separate gas hose that comes in there. But we'll do another video on the setup and usage of the torch. Right now we're just looking how to set up the machine. But when you grab your torch, you want to make sure that it has all the parts. So again, tungsten, end cap, collet body, cup, and there should be the correct Teflon adapter on here for the torch, and that's really only a problem on the gas-cooled torches, at least here in my shop. All right, in the welding booths, we've got our basic booth set up here. We've got ventilation, tools, what have you, and at the bottom are the wire feeders. And we have this harness that connects the feeders to the machines on the back side. All right, at this stage of the game, it doesn't matter whether we're using the 150 amp torch or the 200 amp torch. Essentially what we're going to do is we're going to take the torch, we're going to make sure the gas valve is shut off. I'm going to hang it at the booth. I don't have a camera person, so I got to work with this, so that it doesn't arc out, because when this is set up for a lift start, a scratch start, that tungsten is going to be live all the time, like a stick lead would be. On the other end, we're going to connect up to these connections behind me. So I'm going to simply disconnect this harness, okay? The gas line is an Eaton Hansen 600 series gas line, gas fitting. It may or may not have the little safety ball on here, so you may have to actually align this with the little ball in order to get that fitting to pop free. Okay, and I'll get a close-up of that here in a minute. We're going to disconnect the DINS connector, and we're going to disconnect the 14-pin plug, making sure that only the large collar on the plug is rotating. We don't want the end with the that's attached to the cable to spin, or it will twist the wires off on the inside. So for the TIG torch, we simply connect the torch to our cam lock. In this case, it happens to be DINs, and we connect the gas lines back up. Okay? And other than coiling up the cable down below, that's it. That's the entire connection. All right, so let's take a quick look at this fitting. This happens to be one of only a few in the entire school that has this little ball on it. But essentially on this gas fitting, there's a small little ball, and although this one's painted in green, I don't know if you can see it, there's a slight, right at my thumb, there's a slight little groove. A lot of those are the paint's removed and they're brass, but that will line up and that will allow that to slide all the way up. If that is not lined up, it will not slide up and the fitting will not release. Okay? These are actually oxygen fittings that are used to make torches quick disconnect, and those are the fittings they use at Bath Iron Works. So that's what we've got here. The DINS connectors, again, they simply need to make sure that they're connected in and twisted over until they are in fact tight. We don't need the 14-pin plug unless we're using a remote, and in the last 3 booths at the school, we only have 3 of the 14 pins connected. We need at least 6, I believe, or 5. But booths 1 through 8, we can actually use remote controls. So at this point, we have the torch hanging up. It is secure. It is not going to arc out on anything. Of course, the power is not on yet. I'm going to open that gas valve up just a little bit, and I'm going to go set my gas flow rate. All right, we have a manifold system here in the school. We're running a gas mixing station, and we have C25 gas here in green. The blue manifold is straight argon. I'm in booth 11, so I have a bundle of gas hoses here, and I'm going to find 11, which is right there, and I'm going to connect up to straight argon gas. That straight argon gas is my blue manifold here in the shop. Again, I have the same Eaton Hansen gas fittings. I'm going to plug in here and I'm going to set my flow rate. I'll pull the camera up a little closer. So I get to fight the air compressor for noise, but I'm going to make sure first of all that this is off, okay? And then I'm going to connect my gas hose. Now, if we were connected to a flux core machine, I would have only a few seconds to turn this on and get the flow rate correct, because the hose would fill, and once it's full, it doesn't flow anymore. But since we're running a gas-cooled torch that is open-ended, I can set this and I have all the time in the world. So I want to look at my argon side, which is on the back. I know it's not visible here in the camera, just the way that it's set, but we only really need about 10 to 12 cubic feet per hour for the size cup we're using. So now that my gas is flowing, I'm going to run back over to the booth and I'm going to turn that flow off so we're not wasting argon. I can hear the gas flow right now, and I simply want to take that valve and I want to turn it off. So that is now ready to configure the machine, the power supply. So here in the school, again, all these booths can be set up in the same way. We've got 12 booths on one side of the shop. And then over here I have my power supplies. So we'll take a peek at those in just a second. All right, now the only difference between this and the older XMTs is that on the older machines you have this arc control feature. Well, that feature is disabled when you're TIGging. So if I come back up to the first machine, I didn't actually go over this. Right now it's on MIG mode, and I press the setup button to get my arc control options. I have inductance at 100% and I can adjust it from there, okay? I press setup again, it gives me my wire type, my gas type, and then it goes back to program. As soon as I put this on TIG, that button does nothing anymore, okay? So that arc control dial is not going to have any function when you're in TIG mode. And again, down here you can simply ignore it. Everything else is exactly the same. On the other end of your torch, we're simply going to disconnect. The students aren't required to hook up the wire feeder because you never know what the next person is going to be doing, and people have to learn to hook up their own equipment. But I'll hook it up today because this is just a demo. So again, I'm going to disconnect my gas line, keeping in mind that in a few of these connections in the school, and I think there's only 3 or 4, I've got that little ball I have to watch out for, and I'm going to disconnect my power. At this point in time, if I wanted the feeder hook back up, I could simply hook it back up and connect gas, power, and again my 14-pin plug. And I am back ready to run flux core or MIG or whatever it was I was working on. My torch can now be coiled up and it can be put away in the stock room. All right, the 2 Dynasty machines are similar but different. The main difference between the 2 machines and the setup of the other equipment is A, that these are always set up for TIG. You don't have to disconnect or unhook anything. B, the gas setup is a little bit different. In order to get the gas flow adjusted, we basically have to activate the machine and turn it on so it's welding. Once it's turned on and the machine thinks it's welding, the gas solenoid will allow gas to flow through. So what we'll do first is basically I'm going to uncoil the Dynasty 300. We'll go over the setup of that first, show you how to set up the gas using a foot pedal for a remote, and that will be the default here, although this can be set to scratch start or lift start. But by default we would use the remote and we would use the high frequency to get the thing started. So let's take a peek at this machine. All right, for starters, the Dynasty 300 and the Dynasty 350 that I have here are liquid cooled machines. So we have the bottom half of this is simply the liquid cooler. You will occasionally get a leak in the system, and you definitely want to not run this with the liquid cooled option on. So I'm going to turn this on, and when that comes on, you can see the hoses jump a little bit and the machine comes on. There's a little light on the front of the liquid cooler that indicates that it is in fact working, but I'm going to shut that off just so you're kind of aware of the fact that and that liquid cooled unit plugs into the power supply up above. Okay? If I unplug that, that Dynasty is dead quiet on its own. So all that noise you hear when that thing is running is that coolant unit on the bottom. So for the video, because we're not going to be welding, I'm going to leave that unhooked so we don't have to listen to it. But please recognize that while you're running this under normal conditions, that should be making noise, okay? We don't want to weld with this without having that liquid cooled unit on, because these torch parts are tiny, and without that water flowing through this torch, this thing will cook itself real quick. So you can see here that we have the red braided hose. That is actually your power cable. There's a tiny, tiny, tiny little cable inside of there. It's carry 250 amps. That is connected to a cam lock right here. And I'm going to disconnect this. This unit is for the remote, and it's right in the way. The newer ones are a little smaller. There we go. I apologize for this. I'm doing this handheld. But basically, that's where the power comes in. And the power goes down through that cord, and there is water, coolant line in that. And that's, of course, on the hot side because it's red. So I'm going to plug this back in and give this a twist. Okay. Now, on this particular machine, the machine itself, through these settings we'll go over in a second, is going to determine whether this is electrode positive or electrode negative. Right now, the lower is the work lead. Okay, we have that little symbol there for the work lead, and up here we have the little symbol like the arc, right? So this is always going to be your torch or your stick lead, and this is always going to be what people refer to as the ground clamp, and that is coiled up over on the side here. Okay. All right, I'll come around to that in a second. So initially, we just have to make sure that we're in the correct mode. So once I turn this on, I'll come around to the front of this dusty old machine. I have the option to set my polarity, and I can set it to either DC or AC. Okay, those are the only options that I have. When I come over to my process selection, if I select right now high frequency TIG impulse is selected, that automatically makes it DC electrode negative. Okay. If I put it on TIG lift arc, and I don't know why you'd want to if you have a remote, but if you don't have a remote, that's the way to do it, it will still be electrode negative. As soon as I switch that to stick, it is electrode positive. Okay, that's under process. So we're going to be TIG welding, and we're going to be using on these machines the foot pedal controller, which is right here, and this is the receiver, the remote receiver for that, which is right here, and the 14-pin connection. And there's no need on this machine to ever disconnect that. Okay. For the remote, we are going to use the remote in standard mode for my students. Step on the gas, you get more heat, let off the gas, and you turn it off. It can be set to a 2-touch hold, so that would use the rest of these settings where you would program a peak amperage and a background amperage. You have a slope adjustment up and down here, and all the other settings. But for basic TIG setup, all we're going to do right now is we're going to focus on DC, high freq TIG impulse, and remote and standard mode. After that, we have your amperage adjustment, and I typically tell the kids to set this around 200 to start, and then they can use the remote control to adjust their amps. Now, in another video, I'll talk about pulsar, sequencer, gas, dig shape, AC wave, all that stuff. But for right now, for basic TIG setup, it's just not required. So, turn the machine on. Again, you should see the cables jump. You can feel the cables with the water going through them when the pump is on, and I've got it off for the video. I like my finger right there, huh? I've got it off for the video simply to make it so I can hear myself think. But the next step is going to be to set the gas. I'm going to put the camera on a tripod. All right, in order to set the gas flow, we have to have gas on, right? Right now, the machine thinks we're not welding, so there's no gas on. So I'm going to basically take my torch. Now this is a 25-foot torch that's on this machine, and I'm going to hang it up in my booth. For the purposes of the video, I'm simply going to hold on to it, okay? And I'm going to make sure basically that it is not near something that is grounded, okay? So I have the torch, it is not near my ground because I have a high frequency starter. That basically means I have a 10 or 20,000 volt circuit that's going to allow this to jump across like a spark plug gap or a stun gun. And if that is near my bench or near my work lead, it will try to start welding on me. And I don't want that to happen. So I'm going to basically make sure that this is out of the way. For the purposes of now, I'm simply going to hold it, and I'm just going to hang it right on the camera tripod, so I have two hands free. But normally that would be in the booth, okay? Don't lay it on your table that's grounded, because it will try to weld to your table, okay? I'm going to make sure that my tank is turned on. Again, this is straight argon gas, so I'm going to open this high pressure cylinder all the way, 100%. You always open these all the way. Okay, once she's open, now I can simply press my foot control and the machine will think that we're welding. So once I turn that on, the gas will now start to flow, and I can open my flow meter and I can get my flow set to that 10 to 12 cubic feet per hour. Okay. If we take a look with the camera at the front of the machine, then we can see that the post flow is turning down because it thinks that I, in fact, just welded. So that is timing out. All right, we're going to take a look at the Dynasty 300. It's a smaller machine, it's a newer machine, but it basically is the same general setup. I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to turn on my tank to get started. And again, I'll open this valve all the way. I'll make sure that my gas flow on the meter is shut off. And then I've got my ground clamp coiled up on one side, or my work lead. Again, I'm not going to weld with this, so in this particular case, obviously you would have to have that connected, the same as with the other machine. But I have a remote control, so we're going to use it. I have my torch right here, same exact style torch. So again, we would have a liquid cooling system here. And I'm going to sneak around the back and I'm going to turn this power supply on. So take a second to power up. So there's nothing wrong with it, it just takes a while. And there we have everything up and running. So again, same as before, we have a liquid cooling unit at the bottom, and we have the light on, but for the purposes of this demo, I'm going to unplug that so I can hear myself think. So again, it's right back here, okay? Now, once that is on the front here, this display is set up a little bit different. We still have an amperage adjustment dial right here. And again, I can set this up to, 195 or 200. Just like before, if I set it on 200, the remote control, the foot pedal over here, will only give me 200. If I set it on 50, it will only give me 50. So the process button right here, I know this is a little hard to read on the screen, but this first button is process. I'm going to basically make my selections by pressing this, and it will bring me up to a menu. Right now, DC, TIG, HF, or high frequency start is selected. I can use this dial right here with a little finger on it to change that selection, okay? And then to select it, let's say I wanted to go to lift arc TIG, I simply press that and it will check that. And then when I press the home button, down here I have DC, TIG, lift arc, and then my tungsten size, okay? I make all my selections using that process. So for normal welding, for basic TIG, for the students, we want DC TIG, high frequency start, and again, I'm gonna press this button to select that, okay? If I go over here to my trigger setting, it has the option for a foot pedal, so that's what it's gonna use, okay? I can change this to a fingertip setting if I want to. I don't really understand why there's a difference here, but there is. I can have a push button that just turns it on, and when I release it turns it off. I might have a push button that I press it once and it stays on, and I press it again and it turns off. Now this indicates that I can program that, okay? And then again, I have this option to push and release the trigger, push and hold the trigger, release the trigger. There's a whole bunch of options here that we would get into down the road if we were doing spot welds or something that we would kind of program. But for the most part here in the shop, we're going to select either foot pedal or fingertip control, okay? Under pulse, again, I have options for the pulsar. We'll get into that and do another video. And then for tungsten, I can select my diameter again by pressing this button, and then I can change that to my different tungsten diameters. We're typically running 3/32 tungsten in the shop, and that simply sets the post-flow time after we're done. So once I actually get these settings adjusted, again, I can press home to go back at any time. And what I'm looking for is DC TIG, high frequency start, and again, 3/32 tungsten. My amperage will be preset there. And for a basic setup here in the shop, that's really all we need. As before, the work lead down here, or the ground clamp if you want to call it that, you can see is connected right there. So there's the cable. That will always be on that side. The torch or the stick rod will always be on this side, and the settings will flip your polarity if in fact they need to be reversed. This is, again, a liquid cooled torch, so we want to make sure that while this is running, we can feel that water running, and again, that the cooler is actually on and circulating, okay? So basic setup is simply like that. Just as before, in order to adjust the gas, I'm going to have to press the foot pedal. So I'm going to take that out, and right now my torch is on the right side, my work lead is on the left, so nothing is going to arc out, and I'm simply going to press that foot pedal down, and it will think I'm trying to weld, and now I can go ahead and I can adjust my gas flow. So I can turn this knob up and I can get that gas flow. And I really only need about 10 to 12 cubic feet an hour for a number 8 cup, and that is plenty for working here in the booth. After a second, that will stop. Okay? Once it runs through its predetermined post-flow time, and again, I've let go of the remote, hands off, that will drop down, okay? Now, at the end of the day, in order to turn that gas off and bleed the line out, what we'll have to do, and this is the same thing also on the other Dynasty, is we'll have to turn the tank off first. And now I have gas in the line, and of course there's pressure on the gauge, so I simply have to press the remote and allow that to bleed off. And I'm simply going to hold that down until that pressure is dropped off to 0. The ball will drop and the gas is off. Now I can simply close my shutoff valve and she's down. Okay? In terms of shutting down at the end of the day, we're simply going to coil up our leads on the places provided, take the remote, place it back in the holder, and then we'll turn off the power on the back side. So I'm going to hook that pump back up before I forget, because it should be plugged in. It's right down here. So in terms of shutting the machine down itself, we simply flip the power lever on the back side, and this turns from side to side to the off position. The machine will do a post cool down if it needs to, and then it will shut itself off. And that's the basic setup. All right, so that was a real kind of quick look at the basic setup for TIG. The first thing a student's going to have to do is they're going to have to come in, get the torches hooked up, they will get the machine set, and then I will come through and I will double check everything, make sure they're hooked correctly to the right gas, the right flow rates, the right machine settings if we're running on one of the liquid cooled machines, one of the Dynasties, and we'll go over everything else from there. So the next video in this series, we will look at the torch parts in detail, tungsten selection, how to get the tungsten sharpened, and once the machine is actually set up, how to start welding. All right, over and out. Thank you. The millennials hate this.